So now that we have a slightly more intelligent caching system set up for our Vue components, let's get back to managing our books. And I'm logged into the site right now, and of course, I can list books. And what I want to have happen is when I click on one, I can edit it. And when I come up here and choose Admin Add Book, I can actually add a book. And I'm going to start with adding books. So let's choose that and see what happens. Not surprisingly, it's a stub component. And this stub component actually exists in our front-end source code in this component, bookEdit.vue. And what I'm going to do is set up the front-end component to the point where I think it's going to work, and then I'll go write the necessary back-end handler for that particular component to call. So let's get started. So the first thing I'll do is change the title, and I'll change it to something more meaningful, maybe add/edit book. And I'll give it a horizontal rule just to be consistent, HR. Now I want a form. And of course, I'm going to use my form-tag component, which I'll have to import. And I'm going to give it a click event. Not a click event, an event listener. When you get the event book edit event, you're going to call a method that doesn't exist yet called submit handler, just like in our other forms. And I'll give this a name and I'll call it book form. Not important, but I'm going to put it there anyway. And the event, of course, has to be exactly what I have over here. So I'll copy this and paste it in there and close the opening form tag. And then I'll put in a closing form-tag. Now, let's come down here and let's import everything we think we're going to need. We're already importing security, so I'm going to have to import form tag. So I'll import form tag from, and I'll use this syntax, @/components/forms/form tag. Okay? And then I'll duplicate this and just change it. So I need the form tag. I also am going to use text input. And of course, that's text input. And I'm going to duplicate that. I'm also going to use the select input, which we might have to work on, but we'll get there eventually. Select input and select input. I'm also going to use Noti. Not right away, but I will be using it. So import Noti from Noti. And that might be enough to get us started. Okay, so back up in our, well, let's come down here and put in as well our methods. And we have one method for sure, and it's going to be called submit handler. And I'll just put it in there and leave it empty for now. Okay? Now back up in our form tag component, let's get started entering the things that are going to have to be there. And there's not a lot of information, but there is some. So to start with, every book is going to have a cover, except a new book, of course. It doesn't have a new cover. So how do I know whether or not a book actually has a cover? Well, we're naming our cover images slug.jpg. Whatever the value for the book is, whatever its slug value is, we just append .jpg to the end. So all I have to do is put in a div here, and I'll put a vif. And the vif is equal to this.book.slug, which doesn't exist yet, but it will shortly, is not exactly equal to, let me get rid of that quote, that doesn't belong there. Try that again. Put it here. An empty string. Okay, so there's my div. And I'll give it a class as well, a bootstrap class, just to give it a margin bottom of 3. MB-3. And then I'll close this div. And inside of that, I'll put in its image. Okay? So the image, if you recall, we used this syntax before, img, and then we vbind source equal to, and then we use our backticks to use a JavaScript template, and we have this.imagePath, which doesn't exist, but I'll be adding it in a minute, and then /covers/ and then this.book.slug.jpg. And we'll give it a class of, say, image-fluid. I don't want it to be huge, but I do want it to have a border. So I'll put image thumbnail. And I'll also give it a class that doesn't exist called book-cover. I'm adding a lot of things that appear not to appear right now. Maybe I'll give it an alt tag. Alt equals cover. but we'll be adding them here very shortly. Okay, so this backtick doesn't belong there. Let's get rid of that. Let's put it over here where it actually belongs. Okay, that's syntactically correct. Now let's go down here. I've added image path and book as data that we're going to have in this particular component. So let's go set up its data. So down here, after before mount, which can be mounted, it doesn't make any difference in this case, but that's okay. Let's put in a data function that returns a few things. So it's going to return, first of all, a book. And this time I'm going to specify all of the information for the book. A book will have an ID, defaulting to 0. A book will have a title, and these correspond to the database fields, of course, which is an empty string by default. Author ID, that'll default to 0, because we're looking up our authors from the database, and each author has a specific ID. Publication year, which has to have a lowercase y in year. I'll default that to 0 because it's an int in the database. Description, empty string. Cover, that's not in the database, but I need it here. It's an empty string. Slug, which is in the database, that's an empty string. And then a book also has genres, which will just be an empty array. And a book also has genre IDs, which is not in the database, but we need it. And that's an empty array as well. So that's my book, okay? I'm also going to want a drop-down list of authors, so I'll just say authors. And that's an empty array. And that needs to be inside the return statement. I went too far. So cut that out of there, put a comma here, and paste it into there. And let's give ourselves some room. So I'm going to have authors. I'm going to have image path, which I've already referred to, image path. And that's equal to process.env.view_app_image_URL. And the last thing I want, and I could look this up from the database, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to hard code the genres value, because books can belong to one or more genres. So I'll call this genres, and it's different from the genres that's part of book. These are the available genres. This one up here on line 42 are the genres associated with a given book. So I'll make this an array of objects. And it'll have value, 1, and the text is, I'll just leave it like that for right now, and then duplicate this a total of 7 times, or 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Because there's 7 in the database. And I'll change this to 2, and this to 3, and this to 4, and this to 5, 6, and 7. The first one, if you look in the database, is science fiction. The second one is fantasy. The third one is romance, which I'll never use, but I put it in there. I don't actually read romances, ever. Then thrillers. I've been known to read a thriller or two. And then mystery. And horror. And classic. And I needed a comma down here. So that's our data. And this has to have a comma. And we have an error here somewhere. What's the error say? Expression expected. So let's see if we have this right. Get rid of this comma. That looks better. Okay, so there is my data. Now let's go back up to our form and see what else we need to have in here. The first thing I want to add, after the display of the cover, if it does exist, is another button. And this one will be to choose a cover from your local file system that you want to upload to the server. And that's going to require a bit of work. But let's get started. Div class equals mb-3. And I'm just going to do the entire form component or form element exactly as it appears on the Bootstrap documentation. Okay, so we have a div, and we give it a label, and this will be for equals, and I'm going to call this form file because it's a file we're uploading from this form. And the class equals, from Bootstrap's documentation, form-label, and the label is actually cover image. and we'll close the label. And then we have our input. So there's two inputs possible. Input, and there's a v-if condition. If this is the first time you're entering this book, then this is a required field. So this.book.id is exactly equal to 0, which is the default value, okay? And I need to give this a ref, because I need to have access to this in my JavaScript for this single file view component. And I'll call this cover input, just so I can get to it from JavaScript. And class is equal to form-control, and the type is equal to a file. It's a file input, and the ID is equal to form file. Even though I'm not going to use that, probably I'm going to put it in there. Then I'll go to the next line, and I'll tab in a bit. This will be required if the ID for the book is 0, so required. And we're only going to accept image/JPG because I don't want people to upload a .ping file, since I'm assuming that the actual cover is going to be in the form of a JPEG. And this will say you can't select anything that's not a JPEG. And there needs to be an E in JPEG, I see. That's better. And we'll give this an @change event that calls load cover image. That doesn't exist yet. We'll make it in a minute. Okay? Then I'm going to copy this whole thing and paste it here and fix the formatting. I'm going to remove required. And I'll add a v-else attribute. v-else. Okay? And get rid of this v-if, obviously. So, if it's a new book, this is a required input. If it's an existing book, you don't have to change it. Now let's go put in a stub method down in methods called load cover image. So down here in methods, I'll add load cover image, which doesn't do anything for the moment. Okay, with only those few changes, I can't preview this yet because I'm using misspelled components everywhere here. Very sloppy today. Components. Let's copy this, paste it here, and let's add a few more inputs to the point where all of our required things are showing up, okay? Just to save a bit of typing, I'm going to paste this in here and then format it. This is the text input, and then we'll use this as the basis for all the other ones. So this is using our text input component, and it's the book title, okay? Now before we forget, let's go down here and add a components section to our export default. Components. And we're going to have form-tag, which is form tag. And then I'll duplicate that and make this text input, text-input, which will be text input, and duplicate that and make this a select input, and make that select input. Okay, and then put a comma here. So now we have those required components, both imported and used. And I can comment out Noti now and go back up here. So for the sake of simplicity, let's just put a little simple select statement in there and just have a look at this and see what it looks like. And make sure that everything is appearing the way that it's supposed to. So after my book title, let's put in a select input, and the name here will be equal to, try that again, author-id. It will v-model this.book.author_id. Its items will be equal to this.authors, which is empty right now, which is fine. Required will be equal to required. I have to have that. And the label will be equal to author. And we'll close our select input. Now at this point, since I've commented out Noti, everything should compile. So I should be able to go back to my web browser and have a look at this. So let's go back to home, reload this to make sure it's current, and go to admin and add a book. Okay, so we have a means of browsing for a particular image cover we want to upload, so I'll cancel that. And we can enter our title and we can enter our author. This is coming along reasonably well. So few other changes we have to put in here, of course. We need to have the publication year, so I'll copy this one, put it after the select input, and format it appropriately. And this will model book.publication year. And the type in this case is a text. The required is true. The label is publication year. And the value is book.publication year. And the name is publication-year. So we have the publication year. Now we want the description. So I'll just hit return a couple of times, get to the correct indent level, and say div class equals mb-3, and close that div. I'll close this while it's compiling. That's distracting me. And here I'll put in a label, for equals description, class equals form-label, and its description. Close the label. And now we'll have a text area. We don't have a component for this, and it doesn't matter. This is a simple thing to do. We'll make it required, and we'll v-model it to book.description. And its class will be equal to form-control. And its ID will be equal to description. And rows will be equal to 3. That should be enough room. And then just close the text area. Okay, let's have a look at that. So back over to our web browser. That looks okay. So publication year is 0. That's odd because it's a number. That's why the 0 is showing up. But we might fix that later on. But everything else looks pretty good. Now we still need to add the genres bit down here. And we still need to do some actual population of the authors so we actually can get a list of authors. But we'll take care of that when we get to the back end. Let's just finish the form up. Now this lecture is getting pretty long. So I'll pause at this point and come back in the next lecture and finish off the form.